I remember standing under the thin porch light, coat half buttoned, the collar damp, watching the slick street where my car had lived for 5 quiet years. It was a small thing to notice if you were not looking for storms. The way headlights bent over puddles, the soft hiss of tires, the neighbor's cat slinking into shadow. But that night, every ordinary noise felt loud, as if the weather had turned up the volume on every small betrayal. The scratch was a long, arrogant crescent across the driver's door, a scar that sliced through years of careful polishing and small kindnesses. It caught the streetlight and flashed like a white flag I had never meant to raise. My hand went to the metal, as if to feel the wound, to make sure the cold edge of truth was real. It scraped under my fingernail and left a taste of tin in the back of my mouth. I knew, before I had time to fashion a question, whose hand had made that mark. The thought came to me, not as a triumph, but as a slow, heavy certainty, as if a clock had struck a bell only I could hear. My son's wife lived across the street now, a bright house with too many plants and a lawn she insisted on tending like an argument. She had smiled at me before, in curated ways, the way someone rehearses when they expect an audience. I had assumed she loved my son the way she loved a glossy magazine spread, for the picture it showed, rather than the pages underneath. I did not shout. I did not storm across the road and throw accusations like damp newspapers. Instead, I breathed the rain and let it write its own small elegy across my cheeks. The humiliation was not just the damage to the car, though the car had been my pride, the last practical thing that belonged to me alone. It was the meaning behind the scrape. Someone had wanted me to feel small, visible, and open, and suddenly, embarrassingly exposed. Someone had chosen to make me known in a way that left no choice but to suffer under the public eye of a cracked lacquer and a slick crescent of ruined metal. There was a time, once, when such things would have prompted immediate defense, a word, a hand, a scene. But I had grown into better weapons. When you have lived long enough, you discover smarter ways to keep your dignity. I closed the car door softly, letting the lock click like the end of an argument, and walked up to the porch where the light hummed, and the house smelled like lemon oil and old books. I would not let anger be the first cloth to blot the wound. I would not let hurt decide my movements before thought had had her say. Inside, the kettle hummed, and the house was the familiar map of my life. A photograph of my husband on the mantel, a mug chipped at the rim where I had once dropped it in a hurry, the small clock my mother had given me that still ran despite our attempts to fix it. I made tea and watched steam rise like pale smoke, signaling a truce. I felt ridiculous and tender in equal measures. The world outside carried on, cars drifted by, lights winked, the distant murmur of television shows and children's laughter, while my heart reversed like a tide, calling back old damage and memory. That night I slept fitfully, dreaming of lines, not the scratch on my car, but lines of saying that had been left untold for years. In my dreams, the scratch multiplied, a map of every small thing anyone had ever done to mark me as less than I was. A missed birthday, a silent dinner table, a glance that turned away. I woke before dawn with the taste of tin and rain in my mouth, and a clarity that felt both cold and cleansing. If she thought the mark on my car would mark me for less, she had misread the ledger of my life. The story had been written in many hands, but I had the last page. I did not want the story to be about revenge in the way the world imagines it, violent, loud, a show meant for an audience. I wanted something quieter, a rebalancing that would feel inevitable, as if consequences were simply gravity finally calling the stones home. The plan that visited me at dawn took shape as naturally as steam curling from my cup. It was simple, patient, and unhurried. It required nothing but time and the kind of deliberate kindness that has the power to unmake cruelty more effectively than than any shout. I buttoned my coat and walked to the window that faced the street. Across the way, the house where my son and his wife slept looked like any townhouse at rest. Blinds down, one lamp burning, a curtain half open like an eye. In that half second, I could see the reflection of myself in the glass. Older, yes, but upright. I tapped the pane with 2 fingers, a small promise to myself. If she had wanted to humiliate me by scratching metal, I would answer not with claw, but with a precise, quiet music. I would show instead the small things she had not counted on: patience, resourcefulness, and a steady, unapologetic dignity. The rain had written my name on the night. I intended to answer not with noise, but with something softer, an ending that would come not from me, but from the world rearranging itself around truth. When the time came, it would not be scandalous. It would be final. Before grief trailed its long shadow across my days, there was a warmth to my mornings I keep returning to when I close my eyes. Our house smelled like toast and lavender. My husband and I kept the kettle on the back burner as if it were a perpetual lighthouse. The yard was small but honest, a strip of grass that my husband insisted on mowing himself, a single apple tree that would give us fruit in the late fall, red and patient. Our son grew up beneath that tree, sticky-fingered, loud, and confident in ways that both frightened and delighted us. Those were good years, not only because there was laughter, but because we were busy with the business of ordinary love. I learned my husband's rhythms, his preference for thick coffee and a steady radio in the workshop. And in return, he learned the small maps of my face, the upturn of my left eyebrow that meant worry, the sigh that came when I was content. We arranged our life like a hand-knit blanket, sometimes uneven, certainly patched, but warm where it needed to be. My son married young. The first time his wife came to tea, she pressed her hands together like a prayer and thanked me for the lemon cake I had not yet set out. I saw then the kind of woman who had learned to make peace with first impressions, who polished her laugh until it shone sufficiently bright for company. For a while, she fit into the cracks of our life like a new tile in a kitchen floor, noticeable but steady. She was good with parties and celebrations, excellent at birthday cards, and astute at remembering the small details that made her seem thoughtful. My favorite brand of tea, the correct placement of cushions. Time, as it always does, revealed another side. Little things crept across the years, a paper cut of tension that deepened into a line. Her laughter faltered at some family stories. She would put aside my recipe notes with a tightness in her jaw, as if the knowledge of how to make lemon cake belonged to a territory she had not yet conquered. For a while, she fit into the cracks of our life like a new tile in a kitchen floor, noticeable but steady. She was good with parties and celebrations, excellent at birthday cards, and astute at remembering the small details that made her seem thoughtful. My favorite brand of tea, the correct placement of cushions. Time, as it always does, revealed another side. Little things crept across the years, a paper cut of tension that deepened into a line. Her laughter faltered at some family stories. She would put aside my recipe notes with a tightness in her jaw, as if the knowledge of how to make lemon cake belonged to a territory she had not yet conquered. Sometimes she would lean too close to my son when we talked, her arm bridging my space with a possessiveness I did not know how to name. When our grandchildren were born, I felt both the surge of being useful again and the creeping of a new rivalry I had not signed up for. The house across the street changed hands, and my son and his wife moved into it with a youthful flourish. I remember the driveway, smooth concrete, a place where cars parked like sleeping beasts. My car sat there often, a compact blue thing that had ferried us to school plays, soccer matches, and my husband's last hospital visit. It was not ostentatious. It was honest and well cared for, like most of the things I owned. I took pride in the small rituals of caring: polishing, checking oil, tucking a clean scarf into the glove compartment for cold mornings. Neighbors were important in our neighborhood. People watched over each other like spare blankets. If one house had a storm, the others offered shelter. That community had a cadence: garden parties in the spring, barbecues in the heat, a chorus of holiday lights in the winter. There were feuds, too, of course, small and shapeless, old ladies with grievances about hedges and dogs. But nothing had prepared me for the quiet cruelty that would one night be delivered in the form of a scratch. My memories of that pre-scratch life are soaked in the soft colors of routine. There was an ease to being known. People understood my rhythms and accounted for my quirks. My son, who once hung on every story I told, would still come by for a cup of tea, but the pauses between us lengthened. He had a life to care for, a job, a home, a woman who needed him. I understood that we all change. The world insists we must. Still, every change cuts a little place in the map of trust. I remember, too, the small kindnesses that used to float like confetti through our days. My neighbor would take in my mail when I was away. A friend would drive me to the doctor without drama. My husband taught me how to repair a chair leg and lent me his patient hands for years. These are the little deposits of life, the small currencies that add up to a feeling of being treasured. And then, like a storm that arrives early in spring, a line appeared where there had been none. A misunderstanding about an invitation, a dinner arranged without me, a Christmas photo where my place at the table was suggested rather than asked. My feelings were not dramatic at first. I rationed them like salt, sprinkling out small disappointments until they tasted like betrayal. Trust is a kind of fabric. You don't see the fraying until the light hits it just so. The scratch on my car was not the beginning. It was a punctuation to a paragraph I'd missed, a final, deliberate comma that made a sentence sour. Still, there were mornings when the sun would slide across the kitchen floor and everything would seem as it used to be. I would make coffee and trace my husband's name on the condensation of the window and pretend, for a luxurious half hour, that nothing had changed. I wasn't blind. I was choosing to remember the parts of us that were soft and faithful. Maybe that is what aging does. It teaches you the economy of grace. You begin to keep your love for certain hours and save your anger for quieter battles. Those years, the ones before the scrape, taught me that life is a ledger of small kindnesses. They also taught me that people can show their colors slowly, like a tide washing in. If you are patient with a person, you may learn the true map of their contour, whether they will shelter you or use you as a stepping stone. I had tried patience. I had tried to be generous with my son and his wife. But generosity does not mean being a doormat. It means that when someone puts a mark on what you love, you have every right to make a mark back, not with the same jolt of spite, but with something that teaches without shaming. So the life before the scratch becomes in my memory a series of warm rooms where I learned how to keep my dignity. It was also the school where I learned how to be precise with my decisions, what to protect, what to let go, and how to carry a quiet, steady anger into a future that did not require me to shout to be heard. The storm came later, but the house of my heart had been built of true, ordinary things. That is why I refused to let a scratch define me. There is a peculiar sound to the world when something begins to split. It is not dramatic, no shattering glass or theatrical thunder, but a quiet sideways ticking, like old nails settling in wood. You notice it in the pauses. A joke that used to land now sits flat. A conversation that once had a double meaning of affection becomes a ledger of obligations. These were the fault lines that appeared between my son and me, thin at first, then widening like hairline cracks in a porcelain cup. At dinners, she would place herself at the center of every story, smoothing the edges until no one else's anecdote had room to breathe. She was talented at claiming air. My son, who had been the boy who once shared his dessert with me when I watched soap operas late at night, now nodded as if he had always been amused, never remembering the small debts of love he once owed. I tried not to take it personally. I am old enough to know that young marriages build their own gravity. But there are moments when love mutates into possession. And when that happens, you can feel your role in someone else's life shrink like a coin that's been worn thin. There were other signs too. A birthday card that arrived with an awkward late signature. A phone call that went to voicemail and never came back. Small things, but cumulative. She began to correct me in front of the grandchildren, speaking with the authority of a teacher who believed the room agreed with her lesson. I could see the children tilt toward her as if she were the new sun, the bright thing around which they turned. My heart did not protest loudly. I simply made smaller demands, rearranged expectations to fit into a life where I was less central. Once she left a set of gardening shears on my steps after trimming the hedge into a shape I did not like. She said, "I thought you might prefer it like this." I smiled and kept the hedges as they had been, hiding the loss with a laugh like a bandage. Inside me the wound turned into a calculus, a counting of favors and dismissals. I kept records in my head that I never intended to use as ammunition. They were simply keeping time. There were gatherings where I felt the temperature drop as soon as she arrived. Her gaze would pass over me with the kind of coolness that speaks of strategy. Once, at a small family picnic, she chose the seat next to my son, elbowing me with a side glance that suggested territories had been redrawn. I remember the way the sunlight at that picnic fell through the leaves in strips, making the scene look like a movie still. A deliberate composition where my face seemed slightly out of frame. My friends noticed nothing, but I felt the curve of distance grow. Conversations with my son became threaded with small apologies he never quite made. "I'm busy," he would say, the words dropping like coins. The truth is that love requires an economy of attention. When attention shifts, wounds appear not from what is done, but from what is no longer done. I could forgive actions. It is harder to forgive absence. I began to watch people the way you watch weather, reading the clouds for meaning. When they came at me with kindness, it often felt measured, like a performance. I do not judge theatrics. We all need to rehearse. But there is a difference between rehearing a scene to make someone comfortable and being continually scripted out of your own life. Those small slights began to collect like lint in a pocket, a silent accumulation. One clear afternoon, I found a note tucked under my door. It was short, formal, in an unfamiliar hand. "We thought we would take care of the lawn this week. Please don't worry." The tone was polite, almost bureaucratic, and beneath it, I tasted a rudeness that had nothing to do with the actual taking care. She had decided without speaking. In the small domestic economies of neighborhoods, the question is as important as the action. Had she asked, I would have declined with a laugh that hid a flinch. By deciding for me, she drew a line. These were not dramatic insults. They were fractures that built upon one another until my patience resembled a stretched rubber band. If someone keeps tugging at your edge, you eventually feel the sting of the snap. I kept telling myself I was patient. I kept telling myself I would not be pulled into a fight that would embarrass my son or make the grandchildren look between us like we were bad characters in their story. Stoicism, I had learned, is an art, but so is setting a boundary. If the world teaches you anything about aging, it is this: dignity cannot be delegated. It is not something other people grant you. It is the small thing you hold on to, even when those around you try to rewrite the margins of your life. I started leaving small notes of my own, reminders for my son, lists of things to do. They were practical, mundane. That was the point. In the quiet, ordinary paperwork of life, I proclaimed my presence. But nobody reads the mundane. until the mundane is suddenly absent. The scratch on the car felt, in that context, like an escalation from the side of someone who would not bother with conversation. It was a public marking, a way to make a private humiliation visible. She wanted people to notice. She wanted to show that she could redraw the map of respect and make me an afterthought. I felt the rawness of it, the same way you might feel a cold draft in a house you thought was sealed. I never wanted to raise my voice in front of my grandchildren. I never wanted to create a scene that would become a story they would tell and retell, turning into the kind of family legend with a villain that sits too comfortably in the telling. But there are ways to repair a map without making torn pages more riven. There are ways to answer a scratch with a patience that stings the pride but teaches the heart. I began thinking in that language, of patient corrections, of reputations restored, not by noise, but by small, steady truths shaped into an unarguable form. That is how fault lines work. They prepare you, if you are wise enough to listen, for the larger crack. They teach you where to stand and what to protect. They taught me, too, to carry my anger like a warm stone in my pocket, present but not brandished. The storm to come would require steadiness. I intended to be steady. That morning started like any other. The scent of strong coffee, the radio murmuring old songs, my hands folding laundry with the rhythm of a ritual. I had been up early, the house clean in a way that felt like a gesture of defiance. A tidy life does not scatter easily. The grandchildren were due to come over in the afternoon, their laughter a balm I had been craving. My son called just after 9, his voice bright but clipped. He said he would stop by with the kids, but there was something in his tone I could not place, a speed as if he were trying to outrun a conversation he did not want to have. Later, a neighbor knocked. "They're moving some things out," she said, and her eyes, which usually held ordinary curiosity, suddenly took on the look of someone passing a rumor. "Did you know?" she asked, lowering her voice as if we were trading contraband. I did not. The words folded like a letter I had not yet opened. I felt the color leave my hands. My son arrived with his shoes scuffed and his smile thin. He hugged the children and asked about bedtime routines, the way people do when they are working through heavy things and need a map to follow. In the kitchen, the radio played something slow and small. He avoided my eyes, as if mine might be checkpoints on a road he preferred not to travel. Then he said, almost in an aside, "We decided it's better if we—" and the sentence splintered there, unfinished. I have learned more about a person in what they leave unsaid than in what they declare. The silence is often the heaviest thing between two people. I set my cup down slowly, as if to anchor myself. "Decided what?" I asked, and it sounded like a soft question. He swallowed and looked out the window, at nothing and everything at once. "We thought it's best if maybe you spent some time elsewhere." "For a little," he mumbled. And then his hands moved in that directionless way that makes rooms feel colder. The words hit like a hand closing a door. They were not dramatic in their cruelty. They were bureaucratic, as if comfort could be scheduled, as if a person could be placed like a spare chair when they were inconvenient. He tried to soften it. "It's not forever," he said, but his voice betrayed the phrase as a borrowed line designed to soothe. "We'll help you move things," he offered. It felt like being offered a taxi after you had been pushed out of your home. Grief has a peculiar voice. Sometimes it is loud and angry. Sometimes it is a numb, quick sense of unreality. Mine first arrived as astonishment. How could the people I loved decide, as if reading a list, to pack me like an old sweater? Where did the love that had once been steady go? I asked him plainly for reasons, a conversation I had been wanting for months disguised as a small crisis. He struggled, then mumbled about boundaries and new starts and the wife's need for a fresh space. It landed in me like a cold stone. The grandchildren did not understand why I did not smile adequately. They fussed at their mother, asking for snacks and toys. I watched my son become a different man, one who chose the path with the least friction and the least confrontation. At one point, he touched my hand in a way that used to be comforting, and now felt apologetic. Apology without accompaniment is like a coat with no buttons. It flutters and remains useless. By noon, the house held a hush heavy enough to press a handprint into. Boxes were brought in with the efficiency of people used to making rooms disappear. My kitchen, which had been the center of so many conversations and casseroles, felt like the subject of a final inventory. There were small indignities, of course. "We've labeled things," they said, as if my life could be summed up in marker strokes. There was also a sense of theater in their politeness, a curated cruelty that believed civility could hide what it took. I did not throw things. I did not make scenes. I packed slowly, with the care one gives to the last letters of a lover. Each plate, each book, each picture was wrapped not only in paper, but in the memory of how it had been used. A mug on a rainy afternoon, a scarf at a funeral, a postcard from my sister. I made a small pile of things I could not bear to send away. A photograph of my husband in his work shirt, the little clock my mother had given me, a scarf he used to kiss my cheek with when the wind was mean. When they lifted the last box into the moving van, the neighborhood watched in that quiet way they do, like an audience that feels it has been invited to witness your private collapse. The grandchildren waved, confused and obedient. My son stood by the van, looking like he had been chosen for a part he had not auditioned for. The polite executioner. At the last moment, he hugged me and said, "We'll call," like a promise the sea cannot keep. The door closed behind them. It made the final sound, a firm, ordinary click that signaled a change as profound as any door that locks against a person. I stood on the porch, the air tasting like used tea. For the first time in many years, I felt very small, unnerved by the sudden elasticity of my life. The rooms that had once held our laughter echoed with the memory of it, a sound you can almost touch, but not hold. When you are suddenly displaced, reality can feel like a thin film that you press at with your thumb and expect to pop. I pressed and the film held. The world went on as if nothing had happened. Children playing, a dog barking, a mail truck making its rounds. The incongruity between the life I had known and the immediate present made me dizzy. I had arrived at the edge of something that required a decision. Revenge appears in many forms. Some choose spectacle, others choose silence. I knew then that whatever I chose next would have to be done with a kind of cunning that neither screamed nor crumbled. If she wanted to humiliate me by making my life publicly small, I would reply with a series of movements that would make her victory into something like an indictment. I did not want to hurt my son. I wanted to protect myself. That is the line you learn to trace where love and self-preservation meet. The house echoed its emptiness, and I listened to the clock for answers. Time, older than both of us, would be my ally. The door had closed, but I was not finished. I had patience, and I had memories. I had also, it turned out, the most effective weapon there is, a clear, calm head. The first nights after the van left felt like living in a photograph that had been misprinted, edges cut off, colors washed out. My bed was too wide and too quiet. The kettle no longer held the comfort of two mugs steeping contentedly. Silence wrapped itself around the house like a new, unfamiliar blanket. At first, I tried to fill it with the television's low hum, a neighbor's radio, anything to trick the ears into forgetting the absence. But silence is stubborn. It returns like a boomerang. Loneliness is not merely the absence of company. It is the presence of a particular kind of quiet that asks intrusive questions. Why was I expendable? When did love stop looking like warmth and start looking like convenience? Who had the right to decide where I belonged? These questions rolled and rolled in my mind like small stones in a tumbler, polishing away at the edges of my certainty. I found, unexpectedly, the opposite of emptiness, a slow accumulation of small tasks that became the scaffolding of a new day. I repaired things I had let go for years. A chair leg that had begun to wobble, the loose tile in the kitchen, the garden fence that had always leaned a bit too proudly. There was a dignity in working with my hands, in naming each fix as something I could control. Each screw tightened felt like an affirmation. This is mine to mend. Visits were sporadic at first. A niece brought a casserole that smelled of basil and an apology for not calling more often. A friend from church sat with me and talked about ordinary things. The weather, a book she had read, the neighbor's new cat. They could not unmake the hurt, but they brought practical comfort. There's a kind of therapy in small kindnesses. A loaf of bread, a bouquet of daisies, a phone call that insists you are remembered. These were not grand gestures, but they were honest. The house itself was a language I had to relearn. Each room spoke of memories I had to sort like letters. Some to keep, some to file, some to let go. I walked through with a slow, purposeful deliberation, finding the threads that still belonged to me. In the bedroom, I found a sweater my husband had once loved to tug at. In the kitchen, a wooden spoon worn down from stirring the many soups through the years. These were my anchors. There were small humiliations that arrived uninvited. I had to tell the utility company my address change without my son to translate the modern bureaucracy for me. I navigated forms that used unfamiliar language and felt a sting each time a clerk assumed I must have help. It is an odd wound to have your independence questioned when you are trying to prove it quietly. I resented those assumptions like a bitter herb on my tongue. Nights were the worst. With the lamp turned low, the house seemed to grow long in the dark. I would sit with a cup of tea and listen for the creaks that had always felt like companionship and instead felt like evidence of being alone. My footsteps sounded different in empty rooms, echoing as if they belonged to someone else. Sleep came slowly and often in bursts, and yet there was a peculiar relief in the hollow. For the first time in decades, I had the freedom to shape my day precisely to my small influences. I took long walks that stretched my legs and my stubborn heart. I reread letters from friends and passages from books I had once loved, but found too busy to revisit. Little pleasures appeared like coins under the sofa cushions. A new patch of sunlight on the kitchen floor. The precise satisfaction of ironing a napkin into geometric calm. Grief taught me to be economical with my feelings. Anger arrived like sporadic lightning, hot and brief, but mostly I moved through a gray fog of everyday tasks. There was an anonymous delight in small rebellion, planting seeds in the back garden where no one could see, playing records my husband liked, even when it strained the neighbor's patience. In the quiet, I could hear myself think in ways that I had not allowed for years. Sometimes I would stand by the window and watch the house across the street, the one with the immaculate hedges and the bright curtains. There were moments when I felt vindictive, small thoughts that flickered, reminders to call them out, to make them feel the public shame that had been pressed upon me. But those impulses felt shallow. Revenge, when performed for public spectacle, becomes its own jail. I wanted my answer to be precise, to sting like lemon on a wound and then heal. I considered 1,000 tiny stratagems, each weighed carefully against the person I wanted to be. And then, in the folds of that silence, I found a certain clarity. Stripped of the noise of family obligations and the busyness of watchful living, I met myself. There is a cruel kindness in being left alone. You discover what you will not compromise, and you meet the parts of you that had been smoothing life for others' convenience. I started to write again. Letters to friends, lists of small ambitions, a draft of a story that had lived in my head for years. The act of laying down words felt like reclaiming territory. Most nights, I would place 2 fingers on the small clock my mother had given me. Its face had a crack, but it still ran, stubborn as a promise. "We keep going," I would murmur into its soft ticking. The sound answered like a heartbeat. One day, I thought, I would not be measured by another person's decision. I would be a full actor in my story again, not an incidental character in theirs. It was in this hollow that I gathered the proof I would need: patience, observation, and a plan not of malice but of necessity. If cruelty had been delivered by a scratch, my reply would be surgical and final, like closing a wound with precise stitches. I did not want to humiliate. I wanted to reclaim. The house hummed around me, and twice a day the kettle reminded me that steam, too, can move mountains if left to its own patient work. In the back of the linen closet, beneath a stack of blankets that smelled faintly of lavender, I found the box. It was an old biscuit tin painted with roses, the sort of thing you keep because it remembers you. Brittle edges, the faint outline of someone's handwriting on the lid. I had not opened it in years, perhaps since my husband died, perhaps earlier. Finding it felt like stumbling upon a friend who had been waiting patiently at a bus stop for you to notice. Inside were fragments of my life that time could not reduce to dust. A letter from my mother reminding me to always keep the kettle warm. A theater ticket from our first date. A pressed daisy that had once slipped from the pages of a long-ago book, and a small key on a chain. The key was the color of old pennies and warm to the touch. I turned it over in my hands and felt something old and unmanageable stir in me. I had forgotten that the key had ever existed. Memory boxes are treacherous things. They make you feel both richer and more ruinously exposed. Each paper held a story that connected me to people I had loved and things I had been proud of. I ran my fingers over the neat loops of my mother's handwriting and felt the geometry of her presence. I learned that we carry the words of other people like sheets. They keep us warm when the nights grow long. There was a letter in the box I had not expected, a note my husband had written the year he worried he had no more time. He had tucked it into a book for me to find when I needed it. Reading it now, I could hear his voice, slow, with a patience that was never performative. "If you must lose me, do not lose yourself," he had written. "Hold a little stubbornness for you." Tears blurred the black ink and turned the page into a small map of our shared courage. I read the letter twice, then folded it carefully and placed it back, as if the paper deserved a gentle burial. The box gave me more than sentimental solace. It reminded me of the continuity of my being. The little key, in particular, was a hinge in my chest I had almost forgotten. My husband had once hidden a keepsake in a locker at the small town's needlework club where he used to take me dancing before the children came. He had insisted, with a mischievous grin, that I keep the key because you never know when you might need a place that's just yours. I had always meant to go back, to use the locker as a private mailbox of sorts, but life, as it does, carried us away. Now, in the hollow of my house, the key felt like an invitation. Perhaps it was foolishness, perhaps bravery, perhaps a bit of both. But I decided I would find that locker and see what little secret it still kept. I could feel the plan coalescing like a pattern in wet concrete. If she had made me visible by defacing what I loved, I would reply by surviving in a way that made visibility for me into something dignified, not spectacle, but an irreversible repositioning. The memory box also held smaller mercies, receipts from birthdays, a ticket stub from a concert where we had danced poorly and joyously, a photograph of my son when he had teeth like a wolf. Each item stitched me to my life in a way that felt practical and firm. They were evidence that I had lived fully, not as an accessory to someone else's story, but as the main character of my own modest narrative. In the days that followed, the key became a talisman. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling it press like a promise against my thigh as I walked to the market and back. People noticed the change before I named it. Neighbors asked if I was feeling better. Friends remarked on the brightness in my voice. I had not told them of the plan. There is a certain satisfaction in keeping a small, beautiful secret, a private incantation that rearranges the furniture of your future. When I finally set out to find the locker, it felt like stepping toward a door I had always meant to open. The club itself was smaller than memory had made it, a brick building with a squeaky gate and a notice board pinned with faded flyers. I found the row of lockers with my husband's handwriting still faint on the brass numbering. The key turned with a small, obedient click, as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to perform its work. In the days that followed, the key became a talisman. I slipped it into my pocket, feeling it press like a promise against my thigh as I walked to the market and back. People noticed the change before I named it. Neighbors asked if I was feeling better. Friends remarked on the brightness in my voice. I had not told them of the plan. There is a certain satisfaction in keeping a small, beautiful secret, a private incantation that rearranges the furniture of your future. When I finally set out to find the locker, it felt like stepping toward a door I had always meant to open. The club itself was smaller than memory had made it, a brick building with a squeaky gate and a notice board pinned with faded flyers. I found the row of lockers with my husband's handwriting still faint on the brass numbering. The key turned with a small, obedient click, as if it had simply been waiting for the right moment to perform its work. Inside the locker was an odd assortment: a pair of old gloves, a half-finished scarf, and a leather notebook where my husband had once scribbled jokes and half-sentences. Beneath these lay an envelope with my name on it, in his looping hand. My fingers trembled as I opened it. Inside, there was a note that was both ordinary and revolutionary. If she scratches your car, scratch back with paper and kindness. Be clever, be kind. J. That sentence might seem small to an outsider, but it landed in me like a lantern. My husband had always been practical with mischief. He believed in the virtue of the long con, the idea that gentleness administered with tact often accomplishes what hot anger cannot. He had given me permission, in ink, to be both cunning and genteel. I laughed then, a small, astonished sound that felt like the beginning of courage. A memory box did more than provide proof that my life was richer than the scratch on the car. It whispered the right kinds of answers. If I wanted to answer cruelty, I could and would use restraint as my instrument. The key and the note taught me two things: that my life contained resources I had forgotten, and that the best revenge is often the one that admits no spectacle, but instead rearranges the elements of someone's presumption until they no longer function. I closed the locker and walked home with a slower, sturdier step. The rain had returned that afternoon, but it no longer felt like a confessional. It felt like a curtain being drawn, an outer cover for the work I intended to do beneath it. There was a small, secret happiness in knowing I had an intent that was neither petty nor blind. It was shaped like my life, patient, precise, and impossibly tender. A month after the van had rolled away with boxes and polite smiles, the phone rang. It was the sort of late spring afternoon where the light held its breath and the house felt porous, ready to receive news. I almost didn't answer. Grief has a way of convincing you that every ring is another complication. Still, I picked up and heard a voice I had not heard in years. "Hello, is this Mrs. Ellison?" the voice asked. It was a woman's voice, formal yet soft. "My name is Ruth Hayes. I manage the community outreach for the senior center. We were wondering if you might be interested in coming to a tea this Friday. We have a storyteller visiting, lovely woman, and we thought you might enjoy it." I blinked and felt a small, unaccountable lift in my chest. The world had been arranging itself without me for some weeks. Here was an invitation as ordinary and kind as bread. It was the sort of thing my husband would have loved. A room full of people and a quiet, necessary audience for our small lives. I said yes before I knew I would, and the call ended with a cheerfulness that left the house feeling less like a mausoleum. The event itself was simple, a sunlit room where people gathered around a table with teacups like little moons. The storyteller was both theatrical and humble. She told a tale about a woman who saved her life by planting a garden in an abandoned lot and watching her generosity bloom. I sat and listened, letting the cadence of her voice pull me out of the small, repetitive loops my mind had been running. After the storytelling, there was a conversation and then tea. I found myself speaking to strangers about books I loved and the small, secret project I had been reluctant to discuss even with friends. The women listened with the attention of people who had been rehearsing loneliness and therefore understood the language of company. It was there, in that room of ordinary authority, that I met someone I had only heard about through whispers. A neighbor from a few blocks over, Mrs. Green, who had once taught school and had a mind that was both cheerful and precise. She approached me with the sort of directness that is both refreshing and slightly terrifying. "I heard about what happened," she said, looking me in the eye in a way other people had not dared. "I'm sorry. If you need anything, call." Gratitude, when it is unexpected, feels like rain after a drought. We exchanged numbers, and she insisted on helping me check the neighborhood for any other small slights. Her help arrived in the form of practical things: watching my house when I went to appointments, bringing extra soup, and most importantly, offering me a perspective that was not clouded by family politics. There is a certain clarity one gains when the people you choose to trust are not entangled in the same loyalties that blind family members. Around that time, another call arrived from an unlikely corner. The owner of the local garage, a man with grease permanently under his nails and good humor like an apron, phoned to say he had noticed something odd. "Been seeing a car parked at odd hours across from your place," he said. "Thought I'd mention it. Looks different from the others." He described a bright sedan I recognized as my son's wife's vehicle, and mentioned a smear of fresh paint on the bumper. The details were small, the way weather reports are small, but together they began to spell a pattern. I invited Mrs. Green for tea, and we sat with our cups while the neighborhood breathed around us. We spoke quietly about the way people sometimes attempt to push others out by reclaiming physical space, a behavior older than any of us, yet somehow more visible now. She suggested I look into a community mediation program that handled disputes without the need for courtrooms or headlines. She had helped settle a waterline disagreement once and claimed it had a way of making people face the straight facts. That evening, a letter arrived in a plain envelope, no return address. Inside was a typed note that said simply, "We saw what you did," followed by the initials of someone I had once known in the town council. The first emotion was confusion. Who had been watching so closely? Then a realization like the smell of wood smoke. Someone had decided to level the playing field without loudness. The town had its own ways of dealing with small cruelties, and sometimes it used the precise tool of neighborly pressure. In the days that followed, the universe seemed to align with a very human sense of justice. The Homeowners Association called a meeting for neighborhood concerns. One of the attendees, a woman who preferred to live with an open door, brought up the scratch. She spoke about pride in our little street and the importance of keeping mutual respect alive. The tone was not accusatory. It was protective, as if the community were wrapping a blanket around what had been wronged. You could feel reputations tightening like the strings of a purse. I did nothing scandalous. I attended the meeting and sat quiet, letting others speak as if the facts were their own children to guard. When it was my turn, I gave a small statement. I explained the damage, spoke of my disappointment, and thanked the community for coming together to uphold a standard of consideration. My voice did not tremble. It was steady, factual, and fair. What followed was less dramatic than one might expect, and yet more satisfying in a way that mattered. The Homeowners Association agreed to offer mediation and a small fund for repairs when wrongs were admitted. Notices were sent out about mutual respect and the legal ramifications of vandalism. The woman who had scrawled my car had her own small network begin to close in. Neighbors who had previously been indifferent now looked at her with a kind of expectant scrutiny. It is hard to live well in a town where everyone knows the cost of being thoughtless. I did not celebrate anyone's downfall. I do not relish the sight of a person's life rearranged in public. But I noted, with an odd mix of relief and sorrow, that the world had its own mechanisms for balance. Sometimes all you need to do is step out of the way and let ordinary decency assemble itself like a small, righteous crowd. That night, as I lit the little clock my mother had given me and set it on the mantel where the light would make the crack look like a river, I felt a recalibration. The call from the garage, the invitation to tea, Mrs. Green's plain goodness, these were the instruments of a quieter justice than I had imagined. They did not humiliate, they corrected. They made visible what had been just small enough to ignore. When I lay down, the house felt less like a mausoleum and more like a living thing that could hold a wound and begin to heal it. I had expected revenge to be dramatic and messy. Instead, it arrived as a string of people doing small, decent things. Perhaps that is the better revenge, when your life continues with dignity and your community remembers the difference between kindness and cruelty. I had imagined an ending that would be clever and sharp, a scene where I would stand in front of them all and reveal a full-throated truth that left no room for polite deniability. Instead, life offered something slower and, in its way, better. The woman across the street paid for the repair herself. At least that is what the repairman told me. But she did so with a sheepish note that suggested embarrassment rather than contrition. My son began to visit more regularly, hands empty, but his presence, the sort of steady thing that had the power to smooth old scabs. What I learned in that season is the difference between justice and revenge. They are cousins in the language of human hearts, but they wear different clothes. Revenge asks for applause. It demands the recognition of righting a wrong with spectacle. Justice, in the humble, ordinary sense, is quieter. It is the reweaving of the social fabric until an exposed thread is tucked back into place. It is less about punishment and more about restoration. I forgave in fragments. I forgave not because I thought she deserved it, but because forgiveness is a gift you give yourself to stop rehearsing pain. To forgive does not require forgetting. It requires refusing to be defined by the hurt another person inflicted. My forgiveness was a careful, deliberate thing. It was the decision to stop letting the sound of the scratch echo enough to shape my days. There were practicalities, of course. I had the car repaired. It was polished until the paint shone like a new dawn. I kept the photographs of that night tucked away, not as evidence, but as a reminder that the world can be unkind and generous in equal measure. My life resumed its ordinary, glorious shape. I wrote more letters. I watched the grandchildren build sandcastles. And I made tea for neighbors who sat with me and listened without judgment. I also learned the authority of quiet action. When you are older, you have fewer chances for theatrics that change anyone's mind. You learn that the most powerful things are often mundane, but sustained. Patience, consistency, the courage to keep doing the small right thing when the world tempts you to perform erratic big ones. My husband's note, the one that told me to be clever and kind, had been right. There is more power, in the long run, to an unremarkable and humane steadiness than to any flash of public scandal. People in our town still tell the story in small, useful ways, not as a grotesque tale, but as a cautionary memory about manners, how the neighbors rallied, how the scratch was repaired, How the woman learned an awkward humility. My son and I rebuilt a rhythm that had been interrupted. He began to call on weeknights with no agenda other than to ask how I slept. Ye started to trade recipes again and to attend each other's small, ordinary victories. There were apologies too, half-spoken and whole, mumbled and then made whole. And I changed. Not in the sweeping manner of a final chapter, but in the quiet accretion of confidence. I found again the pleasure of my own company and the courage to set a boundary that felt sacred. I took the little key from the locker and hung it on a pin where I could see it each morning. A reminder that I had an inner room no one could lock without my permission. The knock of the world would come and go, but the inner door remained. I had found, under the small indignities and the wash of grief, an unexpected dignity. Perhaps the real victory was this: I no longer measured my worth by whether others noticed my pain or the spectacle of it. I measured it by whether I could rise in the morning and choose to act in accordance with my deepest sense of decency. It is a quieter metric than applause, but it is more lasting. I stopped rehearsing the scene of my humiliation and began to perform a different kind of drama. The one where I rose like a slow dawn and did not insist the world watch. The scratch, for all its initial sting, disappeared from my life in the way that most things do, not by being erased, but by being absorbed into a larger tapestry where it became at most a small motif. The people who mattered, the friends who had tea with me, the neighbors who stood by, and the sun who relearned how to be present, rearranged themselves in my days. The woman across the street? She mowed her lawn and blinked at me with a half-smile. Life is stubbornly ordinary that way, preferring to return to its rhythm if you give it time. On some evenings, when the sky is awash of lavender and the grandchildren are tucked into bed, I sit on the porch with a cup of tea and watch the street. The headlights cast long ribbons across the pavement. The world seems to whisper that things have a way of finding their own level if you do not fan the flames with your breath. I think of narrative arcs and how small kindnesses can be the most dramatic acts of all. If you ask me now what I did, I will tell you this. I did not stoop to match meanness with meanness. I did not trumpet revenge as if it were a banner. I lived my life with care, and when the world offered me a hand, through the kindness of strangers and the slow rearrangement of those closest to me, I took it. The car was fixed. The scratch became a story told softly, like a lesson you pass to the next generation about the ineffable power of patience. For years, I thought they had taken everything that mattered to me. But perhaps in making space where my life had been taken for granted, they freed me in a way I did not expect. I found rooms I had not explored, conversations I had put off, and a steadier way of living that held laughter and dignity in equal measure. If there is a moral, it is this: revenge can be loud, but justice, in its truest form, is patient, quiet, and restorative. We do ourselves the greatest favor by choosing the latter. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more stories like this. Thanks for watching.